All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Operant Innovations podcast. I am so excited to have you here today, and I'm really excited about our guest. I'm here today with Dr. Shane Spiker. Welcome, Shane.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm super stoked to be here.
Awesome. I'm so glad to have you. Um, Before we get going, can you kind of just share a little bit about who you are so that our audience knows a little bit about you?
Yeah. My name is Dr. Shane Spiker. I prefer to go by Shane. I am a BCBAD here in Florida. In the wildness that is this place. I've been practicing in behavior analysis since 2008 or so, working with a variety of folks. Mostly, I've spent a lot of time working with folks with pretty severe, challenging behavior, dangerous behavior, health and safety risk behavior. Mostly adults in the home and community-based setting with disabilities, and specialized working in sexuality. Let's see, what else do you need to know about me? I trained as a clinical psychologist as well. So I do have that training under my belt, and I enjoy music. I like to read. I live near the beach, so it's a nice, calm, quiet place. And I've got kids. I've got, it's all kinds of stuff. So I'm sure a lot of that will emerge as we continue to talk, though.
Yes. Unrelated question. What do you enjoy reading?
I read I'll read anything. I really am not that picky a reader. If it can grab my attention, I'm pretty okay with it. But my two favorite authors are Kurt Vonnegut and Tom Robbins, because they just have really interesting, quirky, unique stories, and just their prose is beautiful. So
yeah, I love that. I'm a big reader myself. So yeah, that's a fun, yeah.
yeah, for
Thanks
sure.
for
It's
sharing.
always interesting to find out what people are reading. What do you like to read?
I mainly read fantasy or
Okay.
romance.
Okay, cool.
Though I'm going through a nonfiction kind of phase right now where everything nonfiction is really interesting to me, which has never happened in my entire life. So,
I think that's just what happens as you get older. Like that's
yeah.
happened to me more recently too. And I'm like, how did I get to this book? How did I get here? But it's a fun journey.
Yes, definitely. So now we're going to take like a hard right and we're going to talk about sex ed today.
Yeah.
So, kind of our overarching topic is the importance of parents teaching sex ed to their children, specifically children with disabilities, though I'm sure that a lot of this is relevant to all children. Um, so, let's kind of just start with why is this an important topic for um, what I wrote is why is this an important topic for children and adults on the spectrum or with various disabilities?
That's a great question. So, let's see. Where do we start unpacking this? I whenever I talk about sex ed, I think about going all the way back to the early history of the United States and start there and kind of go like, yeah, we never really considered it and we never really wanted it to begin with. But I think that that's too long a history. So I would say, as we're talking today, if we're talking about the specific population of folks with disabilities, what we are finding is that sex ed is not happening.
Mm-hmm.
As a general rule, sex ed programs are not often comprehensive and they're not very inclusive. And so you're going to find a lot of programs that people are going to opt out of, families are going to opt out of.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of, as we kind of get into parent perspectives and stuff like that, you'll see kind of, you can understand a little bit of why people would opt out of it. But ultimately, the problem is that the sex ed programs that exist in public schools are not comprehensive. They are inadequate to teach safety skills most often, and they also include abstinence requirements, which is not an effective form of anything really.
Right.
It's not effective teaching. So to kind of lay that context out, we already know that the sex ed programs are not effective in general for the most part, and then you find that with folks with disabilities, they're not going to these programs at all, or they're not ever contacting it.
Mm-hmm.
About 94% of students with disabilities never come into contact with any sort of sex ed curriculum through the public school. And
That's
so
crazy.
yeah, it's a pretty wild statistic. So you've got 94% of students that never contact it. And then on the other side of this, when we start talking about why it's important, you start finding that anywhere between 45 to 80% of folks with disabilities have been sexually assaulted or abused as a result of a lack of knowledge or something like this too. So you've got these both of these issues on either side, where you've got folks
Mhm.
that just have no information, and then you have folks that are being harmed as a result of not having information. And it's a pretty large gap. It's really a valley in the
Yeah.
educational space.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely insane that so many are not contacting it at all, and that we have such high rates of assault and violence and abuse. And of course, we need to do something about that.
Yeah, and I think there's a big misconception. One of the big misconceptions I like to unpack a little bit when it comes to sexuality education is that a lot of times people think people with disabilities are asexual, and that's just not the case at all. And I think another misconception that happens often is people think that sex education is teaching people how to have sex, and that's not at all what happens either, right? So
Hmm.
I think that as we start to look at these stats and look at these statistics that are going on, I think that part of the reason people avoid it or they're afraid of it is because they actually misunderstand what sex education actually is and what it encompasses
Hmm.
and how that is really a safety measure for folks.
Yeah. So that actually brings me beautifully into one of the things that I wanted to talk about, which was that one of the kind of myths about sex ed is teaching quote unquote stranger danger is
Mm-hmm.
good enough. And it's not. And let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So stranger danger it comes with so many problems because the majority of abuses and violence that happens towards folks are not from strangers. They're from staff, they're from family members, they're from folks that they're comfortable with, they're folks that have groomed this person into being a friend or pretending to be a caregiver. And so I think that the stranger danger thing, I think at its heart has a good sentiment or a good idea, but it just misses the mark because it overgeneralizes and undergeneralizes in some areas too, right? So it
Hmm.
overgeneralizes a stranger population, which can include helpers, folks that are in the community that could be helping professionals, but then it also reduces those guards and those barriers that you might have for folks that are actually abusing folks. So there is I think instead of teaching stranger danger, body autonomy I think is a better choice, and
Hmm.
teaching concepts like consent and stuff like that. And so there are better ways to steer that conversation, I think. But yeah, as a child of the 90s, a stranger danger, for me at least, I'm not saying you are, but for me as a child of the 90s, stranger danger was all the rage.
Hmm.
It was you heard stranger danger, and you also went through dare programs. So
Yep.
we weren't allowed to talk to strangers, and we weren't allowed to do drugs. And so now we have this, we're learning more and more about this stuff and finding out that actually those are not effective programs at all.
Right. Yeah. No, I grew up more in the early 2000s, but same stranger danger,
Yeah.
dare. I went through all of that. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. And what we're finding in the research is it doesn't work. None of it works.
Yeah. Yeah. This is going off script a little bit, but let's talk about what does work.
Yeah. So I think a good place to start with that with the idea of what works is comprehensive sex ed. I mean, and
Hmm.
comprehensive sex ed education programs are not explicitly about sexual behavior. They include a lot of different domains. And if anybody here has ever heard me do a CE on this kind of stuff, like I talk about the National Sex Ed Standards, which is from
Hmm.
CCAS. And so when you start looking at those standards, you find that sex education includes menstrual care. It includes dating skills. It includes safety skills. It includes reproductive health. It includes pleasure seeking behavior. It includes a lot of different behaviors inside of that. So when we talk about comprehensive sex education, we're finding that that is the ideal way to go. But as far
Hmm.
as behavior analysis goes, we don't have a lot of research on any of the things that we would need to say that a comprehensive sex education program would be effective. We have some stuff, we have a great assessment from Leland and Stockwell that does gender and nonconforming
Hmm.
language and how to shape up and self-assess our behavior. We've got folks that are talking about the ethics of working with folks with disabilities and assessing and treating in sex education. We have our standard interventions, differential reinforcement works, extinction works, but those typically target inappropriate sexual behavior, according to our
Mm-hmm.
literature, which is complex. So we have a lot of stuff that can work, but what we're finding is that the best way to go, truly the best way to go, is an interdisciplinary space. Being able to work with sex
Mm-hmm.
educators, being able to work with therapists, being able to work with folks that kind of work in this line that can specialize a little bit, because the breadth of sex education is so broad that people that you work with that are in sex education really only specialize in certain areas. And you find that
Mm-hmm.
inside of sexual behavior analysis too.
Yeah. Um, and I think that's so interesting just to hear in the context of the course that ABA Technologies is putting out,
Mm-hmm.
which is interdisciplinary, and not everyone on that course is a behavior analyst.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's it's critically important, and that actually will bring the conversation back to having conversations about family members too. Like
Mm-hmm.
when we start working in spaces, we are experts in behavior, but we are not the only experts that exist in this space, and caregivers are often the experts on their children or their loved
Yeah.
ones. And so having those conversations and figuring out what their values are and what their beliefs are and how we can kind of pull that all together to do meaningful functional sex education for that person, I think is really, really critical.
Yeah. I love how you call it functional sex education, because I think that is so, first of all, from the behavior analytic perspective of, let's think about the function of how we're teaching and how we're going about that, but also in terms of how that applies to that individual's life and what do they actually need to know. It's not just stranger danger, but how are we making sure that we're contributing to them having a great life?
You're absolutely right. And I spent a lot of years working with adults, and the conversations that would come up often were not about inappropriate sexual behavior. It was about a person coming to me and saying they wanted to get married, or they wanted to
Mm-hmm.
have a partner, they wanted to date, or the extent of their sex education was holding hands is sex. And
Mm-hmm.
so and that came from somewhere, that came from some caregiver somewhere that told them that. And so much fear around
Mm-hmm.
a parent having their loved one engage in this behavior, or look at what, once they get into sex education, then they're going to start doing all this stuff, which is not demonstrably not true. But there's just so many factors here, but you're absolutely right. It's like it all leads to somebody having a better quality of life because they're attending to things that are in their life that are going to bring them quality of life. They're attending to happiness indices. They're doing all these things that are bringing them joy. And
Mm-hmm.
we miss the mark a lot. I mean, not just us in general. I mean, humanity misses the mark a
Yes.
lot when it comes to working with folks with disabilities.
Yes. It reminds me of oh, I can't remember her name, but there's an actress with Down syndrome. I think her first name is Madison.
Mm-hmm.
Um and she did a campaign, or I think it was the National Down Syndrome Association did a campaign featuring her, where she was talking about, you assume that I can't drink alcohol, so I don't drink alcohol. You assume that I can't be in a relationship, so I don't get to be in a relationship. And it was all of these things that people assume about people with Down syndrome. And she's breaking all of these barriers. And I think the same can be true of our autistic population as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I in all the years I've worked with autistic folks who have gotten married, who have had
Mhm.
children, who have gotten into sex work, even in, just to be clear, legal sex work. So I just want to make sure that they're not getting
Yeah.
in trouble or anything like that. But there are plenty of times where it was absolutely within their rights. It was within their knowledge base. We worked on keeping everybody safe and making sure, giving them skills and letting them make decisions. There is a part of this conversation that I think there's a larger conversation about infantilization and dignity of risk, and how
Mhm.
those two concepts often clash, especially when you're working with folks with disabilities and especially with autistic folks. That comes up a lot from caregivers mostly. I want to be clear. Like a lot of times it's a caregiver really trying to look out for their loved one, but they're often overstepping and maybe creating some more problems than they need to. And not by their fault, just it's just by the nature of caring so deeply about somebody that you want to protect them at all costs. And I understand that sentiment too. And so that happens a lot. You have, like you said, in this situation, I can't drink alcohol. Well, there's an infantilization piece there where it's like,
Mhm.
well, you're of age, you are legally competent and legally allowed to consent to this, so why not? Let's have a conversation about being safe at least, and then we can move forward. And I think people are afraid to have the safety conversation.
Yeah. Um, so let's talk about some of those challenges. You know, you were just talking about the safety piece. What are some of the other challenges that specifically parents face when they're teaching sex ed?
So that's there's such a great question. So I can speak to this as a practitioner and a parent. So I'll kind of include a few things, and I will not embarrass my child. So my children. So I don't want everybody to think like I'm not going to do any of that. But what I would say is first and foremost, most parents want to have the conversation. They feel like sex education is necessary. They feel that it's going to improve their loved one's life. They just don't know who is responsible for it and when to do it. And there's some really great
Mm-hmm.
studies that that survey caregivers with folks with disabilities, and they kind of just say like, yeah, this is very important. I think my child, my loved one, should know about this stuff, but they're like, who should do it? And when do
Mm-hmm.
we start having this conversation? And so I think honestly, those two are the biggest challenges as far as like general sex education. I think when you start getting into other areas that are a little bit more complex and maybe even politically charged, when you get into like transgender questions and
Mm-hmm.
you start getting into those spaces, I think that tends to set people off a little bit differently. At least like caregivers when it comes to their loved ones and stuff like that. So I would say that those conversations that are maybe not as common as like menstrual care or masturbation or safe sex and stuff like that, I think those tend to be a little bit more of a challenging conversation, not in a bad way, just a different conversation, and it takes a little bit for somebody to come around a lot of times. And I think the other barrier that I notice a lot is just clashing values. And
Mm-hmm.
those clashing values can come from a lot of different places. They can come from religious backgrounds. It can come from their personal upbringings, their personal histories. A lot of times when I see those values clashes, they tend to be from religious or spiritual backing or basis. But in those spaces, a lot of it's just the person. Ultimately, when you find that shared value, the shared value is, hey, we're all concerned here, so let's figure out what the
Mm-hmm.
concern is and maybe dispel some myths so that we can be less concerned. And so that's what I kind of notice the most is it's usually who's doing it, when do we start doing this, and then that values clash piece tends to show up a lot.
Yeah. And I know there's research on this. I am not as familiar with the research as probably you are. Um, when is the appropriate time to start?
As soon as possible. And people are going to hear that and go, oh no, Shane, da, da, da. I've heard that more than once. But I think it's important to remember that sex education is not about having sex. It's about safety. You can start early when you're working with early learners, like 1.5, 2 years old, and something as simple as teaching them the correct names for their body parts
Mm-hmm.
is part of sex education. Teaching them to accept no, or to be able to say no when people are forcing them to hug people. That is
Yeah.
absolutely something that falls into sex education. Hygiene is something that falls into sex education. So when we have those conversations about when to start, it's not really necessarily about when to start. It's about what the topic is when to start. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're kind of getting at is like ultimately we're running into that issue where it's what do we teach and when do we teach it, and a lot of it's just figuring out that piece together.
Yeah. Um, I think I think that's so important. Especially, I mean, I've heard so many horror stories of just awful things happening that could have been avoided by someone knowing the proper terminology.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we want to avoid that at all costs for sure.
And yeah, I mean, the one example I'll use, I won't use any client examples, but I will use the example of the Penn State controversy where there was some abuses going on, and the people were not using the correct terms, or they were using coded terms, and that's why a lot of that stuff that happened very early on. This was years ago, but when this
Mm-hmm.
happened, the part of the reason that it went so long was because people were not using the correct terms. They were using coded terms and coded words and euphemisms. They weren't using the correct terms, and so people were continuously in that cycle for some time. So yeah, something as simple as teaching the correct words, but people have a hard time saying the correct words too. They have a hard time using anatomically correct words. And that in itself is kind of a unique barrier when you're entering those spaces too.
Yes, definitely. And I am fully aware that like we're not naming any terms here either. More
Right.
so because I'm worried about being banned by podcasting platforms. But
right. Yeah, we're keeping it.
yeah,
We're keeping it clean, right?
yes, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, these are also some of the things. Like I follow some like sex therapists on social media, and they are unable to use certain terminology in their educational content they put out, and so these are challenges that we have.
Yeah, there's social challenges. There's systemic challenges. It's as far as the United States go, and I will speak entirely to the United States part of this, right? Because that's where I work, that's where I practice, that's my experience. We are a private bunch. We do not
Yeah.
like to talk about this out loud. We don't like to even think about it. And we really try to keep all of our cards close to our chest. And that's kind of unfortunate, because I think what happens is people are missing out on good experiences and quality of life experiences, pleasure that they might be seeking that they don't get they don't get the contact. But ultimately, you run into safety issues more than anything else, because people are not talking about this stuff, and they're not talking about this in a meaningful way.
Yes, absolutely. Um, so let's say that we have a parent who is listening and saying, yes, I love everything that you're saying. What do I actually do? You've already talked about using anatomically correct terms, but what are some other tips that you have?
The biggest tip I give everybody is ask for help.
Hmm.
It's perfectly okay not to know the answer. I think that we all have unique learning histories around all of our sex education, what we're exposed to, what we're not exposed to, what misinformation we have. So I always recommend trying to grab some resources from wherever you can. Planned Parenthood has really great resources they have great sex education resources. Because I think the big misconception is that Planned Parenthood is all about abortions, and that's not at all
Hmm.
what it is.
Right.
And so there are some really great resources there that kind of explain how to teach some skills, what to look out for, some signs of different issues, STI prevention, stuff like that. So I think that your best bet is, if you're not sure, you don't have to teach it. You can ask for help, and you can ask for help from somebody, but it's usually better coming from somebody who is trusted, who is safe, who that person can, that learner, that loved one can come to you and ask you questions. And so if you're not sure where to start, read some books, listen to some podcasts from like reputable sources. Like, don't go listen to podcasts that are a bunch of misinformation. Go listen to some really good stuff. And I'm happy to share those resources as we go. But really the one book I always like to reference is a book called, or a resource called, Sexuality Across a Lifespan. And that's a really
Mhm.
great place to start with getting some information about kind of different aspects of sexuality as it occurs throughout somebody's aging.
Yeah. I will find that and link it in the description box so anyone who's interested can find that. But yeah, I would love to hear other resources that you like to recommend.
Yeah. Good places to start are, if you're looking for like more higher education types of spaces, ASECT is really great. That's AASECT. And they are an organization that certifies sex therapists, sex educators, and you can actually, and there's a directory as well that you can actually reach out to
Mhm.
folks and get resources and connect with people there. I think that's one of my favorite resources to share. There is on Instagram, it's the School of Sexuality, I believe. And she's really wonderful. The person that runs that page, they're incredible, and they have really great resources, and they're very open and very vibrant and very fun. They're very good. They're a very fun disseminator. So I really enjoy the stuff that they're doing. And so as far as some books go, I just had a stack of books that I was looking at. Where did they go? I moved them somewhere. I don't remember where I moved them. I can share some I can send some your way,
Yeah,
and we can
awesome.
link them too, because there are some really great ones. There is one that's like sexuality and autism. And just to kind of, for clarity's sake, I tend to work with folks that are legally involved too. So
Mm.
I spend a lot of time working in like the forensic and legislation places, and kind of undoing laws that are unjust, and working in the legal system. So I might not have some more of the parent friendly resources that other folks might have, but we can gather some stuff too.
Yeah. There's also an organization that I cannot think of the name now, but that I am familiar with that I think has some resources.
Mm-hmm.
So I know they're based in Virginia. That's all I can
Yeah.
think of right now.
Yeah.
But I will also link to them below. So hopefully we can provide some good resources.
Yeah, and any place you can start is better than nothing. Just making sure that information is correct. SEICUS is another one, SEICUS. That organization does a really great job of providing resources as well, and they're the ones that provide the national sex education standards here in the U.S.
Yeah. Um, oh, I just remembered. It's the Organization for Autism Research, OAR.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
they're
they
great.
do some great. I don't know how much they have on sexuality, but um, I have used them for a lot of things in the past. So
Yeah,
in
they're
my
great.
past practitioner life. So yeah.
One thing I like to talk about inside of this too is competency.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that is a critically important concept inside of this. Because for whoever's listening, if you're listening to this and you're a behavior analyst, or you're just another professional out there doing some really great work and working in another field, I think the biggest thing that I notice about our field in particular is just a lack of competency. And that's not for a lack of trying. I want to be
Mm-hmm.
really clear about that. If you're listening to this and going like, oh, I feel seen, I feel targeted, I feel attacked. It's like, that's not what at all what I'm saying. Competency is a conversation that comes up often because it's so easy to harm somebody in this space,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't know the information. It's so easy to accidentally do something illegal as a result
Yeah.
of not knowing what to do. I think, so I attended my coursework at FIT, and I'll never forget Dr. Jose Martinez Diaz sharing a story about how he had a practitioner that worked with him that handed a teenage child pornographic magazines and was like, oh yeah, this is my intervention. And he, at that point in time, it's illegal, right? So,
Yeah.
and Jose says that, and he's like, that's illegal. You're fired. Get out. It's a whole problem. But it was one of those conversations that it was, some people just don't know. The
Mm-hmm.
people don't know that you can buy certain materials for certain ages, that you can purchase them under, at certain places. You don't know that some state laws have varying ages of consent. You don't know that
Mm-hmm.
what you can talk about inside of public spaces can actually get you in a lot of trouble. Like, as I mentioned before, in Florida, for me, being in Florida, when you have legislation that's being passed that's pretty harmful and actually attacking marginalized groups, you have this concern that, okay, now can I even do sex education? Because if I do anything that's related to gender studies, is that illegal? Is that
Mm-hmm.
going to cop me a charge at this point in time? And so I do think that competency is such a big, important conversation, but we have to have conversations about the legality of stuff more than anything. Like, what are
Yeah.
you legally allowed to do? What are you legally not allowed to do? Because that's going to impact stuff like parent training. Which parent is
Mm-hmm.
doing the training? Who is allowed to decide who's doing the training? Because you might work in spaces where the caregivers are divorced and they have shared custody.
Yeah.
And so there's lots of these nuanced things that I really want to emphasize with everybody. Please make sure you're competent. And if you're not competent, ask questions. Feel free to email me. I'm totally happy to answer questions for you and with you. I'm good with that. Just don't hurt somebody and don't end up getting in trouble.
Yeah. Well, and I think that also highlights the importance of staying on top of what's current, right? Because what
Yeah.
I think the Florida legislative session is going on as we speak, I believe. And
Yes.
so what is legal today could be illegal tomorrow. These
Yeah.
things change all the time.
You're absolutely right. And some things that you might think are illegal might not actually be illegal. There's a lot that I've learned over the years. I was kind of like, how is that not a crime? And you learn that, and then something will happen. You're like, why did they get arrested for that and punished so harshly? And you'll
Mm-hmm.
learn, the more you spend in kind of the justice system in that space, you learn how unjust it actually is. But as far as for folks that are like looking for practical stuff and like practical implementation of stuff, I do think that those resources, kind of going back to like building the competence and building competence in
Mm-hmm.
those spaces, is really I think really critical. Personally, I'm working on my sex ed certification. So I'm becoming a certified sex educator because I wanted to have that bolstered competency, but I wanted to more so to have that credential behind me to say, hey, look, I am certified to do this, and just kind
Mm-hmm.
of take that further to protect myself too. So
Yeah. Um, I'm interested in that certification. What does that entail? What does that look like?
So this might sound familiar. It's 2,000 hours supervision.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's depends on what. So it's through ASECT, and it depends on which certification level you want to do. You can be a therapist, a counselor, or a sex educator. I went with sex educator because I'm not a very good counselor. That's why that's part of why I left psychology too. And so it includes training. Like it's something like 90 hours of like coursework and training, direct work. There's not a restricted and unrestricted requirement. It's a little bit less strict than the BACB, but it's 2,000 hours of doing direct sex education work, developing trainings, hosting trainings, having conversations, showing up on podcasts, stuff like that. So, all this stuff, it's just that experience. And then you get supervision from somebody. The supervision is much less. It's only 25 hours, I think. And most of it can be group. So
Mm-hmm.
no major limit on that, but it's been a pretty enlightening experience. I've had a really great time kind of navigating that world and learning all kinds of new stuff.
Yeah. What would you say is now I'm just having a good time and
Yeah, let's do
yeah.
it.
What would you say is something like very, very interesting that you have learned that you maybe wouldn't learn otherwise?
Oh, that's really great. I think my biggest learning, I think, jump. Um, I would say it was probably within the within the gender non-binary space. I think that I had to kind of learn at rapid speed in that
Mm-hmm.
space. Growing up, I'd never been exposed to anybody that I knew of that was openly
Mm-hmm.
trans and work and kind of and exploring that, up until maybe 10 years ago. And so, when that, maybe even a little bit longer than that, but when that did happen, I had to rapidly learn all the things that I
Mm-hmm.
could. And I'm the kind of person that is willing to jump in and learn everything I can. But I think that was probably the biggest learning curve that I had was, it took a long time for me to shift my behavior, and not necessarily my thinking so much. I think my thinking caught up, but my behavior that I'm fluent in continued
Mm-hmm.
to rise up. And so, and I'm still working on it. I don't think that I'm
Yeah.
anywhere near competent for that, but I do think that was an area that I learned that it was quite a jump, comparatively, compared to the other areas. It took me quite a while to get where I needed to go.
Yeah. Um, that I think that's amazing though. I think I mean it's fantastic that we're seeing more openly trans and non-binary people that they are able to exist in the world.
Yeah.
But I think it's great that you've also been able to learn and grow in that way. So yeah.
Yeah, and and I think that's just kind of the nature of it. I think that's why I like to talk about competency so much, because I think maybe if you don't know me, I might come across as somebody who talks a big game, or maybe sounds like I know a lot. But just this morning, I was reading all of the latest edition of Java so I could catch up on what's in the research. So like I'm always trying to learn more and grow, because I don't hold any of those beliefs as solidly as a lot of people do. I do hold the value of education and the value of philosophic doubt I
Mm-hmm.
hold those pretty well. And so I think it's just important to keep learning, because it's always
Yeah.
going to change, it's always going to evolve, it's always going to grow and develop, and we're going to learn new things about the world around us. So yeah, I think if anybody here is interested in getting into this world, just be prepared. There's a lot to unpack, but it is really, really quite a wonderful journey.
Yeah. That's awesome. Um, well, is there anything that you kind of just want to leave us with?
Oh, I think the thing I would leave everybody with here is take time to self-reflect, and think about what your own biases are when it comes to this.
Mm,
And I'm not saying that you need to explore any sort of deep dark secrets or change your identity or anything like that. But I do think it's worth taking a second to kind of evaluate what your level of competency and what your scope is. There's a really great assessment tool out there called the PLSSE. I think some people call it the Please, and I can send that over your way as well.
That would be great.
And it's a really great just kind of dive on what your competency is in this world. I think that without self-reflection and thinking about the ways that we enter spaces that have to do with sex education, if we don't take time to think about those and reflect on our own behavior, I think we're going to cause more harm by accident.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably where I would leave everybody, just to try to take time to self-reflect. Think about your behavior, think about your biases, think about where your learning history comes from, and think about your own sex ed. I don't know about you, but my own sex ed was, my experience was my mom handed me a book and said, read this. And I did. And all I learned were all the slang terms for genitals, which was amazing, by the way. So I thank my mom all the time for giving me that. So that's the first one. And then the second thing was my dad tossed me a box of condoms when I was like 16 or 17. I was like, you know how to use these. And I was like, okay, that's my sex talk from my dad. And, by the time I was 19, I was having a baby. So apparently I did not.
Yeah.
And so it was one of those things where when you think about and you reflect on your own sex education and what you've learned and what you've had to unlearn, I think that's critical. And that's kind of an ongoing process. So that's what I think, leave with everybody here.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a really amazing point that, as I've had these conversations with other podcast guests, I don't think anyone has suggested that self-reflection piece. And I think that is really critical. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, to the listener, thank you so much for being here. I hope you've had a fantastic time, and we will see you in our next episode.